In order to understand that existence of the sacred, we must begin by recognizing a true belief in what I have called the stereotype of accusation, the guilt and the apparent responsibility of the victims. Guillaume de Machaut sincerely believed that the rivers were poisoned by the Jews. Jean Bodin sincerely believed that France was exposed to danger by sorcery in his day. We do not have to sympathize with the belief by admitting its sincerity. Jean Bodin was an intelligent man, and yet he believed in sorcery. 2 centuries later, such a belief makes people of even mediocre intelligence laugh. What, then, is the source of the illusions of Jean Bodin What, then, is the source of the illusions of a Jean Bodin or a Guillaume de Machaut? Clearly, they are social in nature. They are illusions shared by a great number of people. In most societies, belief in witchcraft is not the act of certain individuals only, or even of many, but the act of everyone. Magical beliefs flourish amid a certain social consensus. Even though it was far from unanimous in the 16th and even in the 14th century, the consensus was broad, at least in certain milieus. It acted as a sort of constraint on people. The exceptions were not numerous, and they were not influential enough to prevent the persecutions. The representation of these persecutions retains certain characteristics of a collective representation in the sense used by Durkheim. We have examined the makeup of this belief. Vast social groups found themselves at the mercy of terrifying plagues such as the Black Death or sometimes less visible problems. Thanks to the mechanism of persecution, collective anguish and frustration found vicarious appeasement in the victims who easily found themselves united in opposition to them by virtue of being poorly integrated minorities. We owe our comprehension of this to the discovery of stereotypes of persecution in a text. Once we understand, we almost always exclaim, "The victim is a scapegoat." Everyone has a clear understanding of this expression. No one has any hesitation about its meaning. Scapegoat indicates both the innocence of the victims, the collective polarization in opposition to them, and the collective end result of that polarization. The persecutors are caught up in the logic of the representation of persecution from a persecutor's standpoint, and they cannot break away. Guillaume de Machaut no doubt never participated himself in collective acts of violence, but he adopts the representation of persecution that feeds the violence and is fed in return. He shares in the collective effect of the scapegoat. The polarization exerts such a constraint on those polarized that the victims cannot prove their innocence. We use the word scapegoat, therefore, to summarize all that I have said so far on collective persecutions. By mentioning scapegoat when discussing Guillaume de Machaut, we indicate that we are not taken in by his representation and that we have done what is necessary to break down the system and substitute our own reading. Scapegoat epitomizes the type of interpretation I would like to extend to mythology. Unfortunately, the expression and the interpretation suffer the same fate. Because everyone uses it, no one bothers to determine its exact significance, and the misconceptions multiply. In the example of Guillaume de Machaut and persecution texts in general, this use has no direct connection with the right of the scapegoat as described in Leviticus, or with other rights that are sometimes described as belonging to the scapegoat because they more or less resemble that of Leviticus. As soon as we begin to study the scapegoat or think about the expression apart from the context of the persecutor, we tend to modify its meaning. We are reminded of the rite. We think of a religious ceremony that unfolds on a fixed date and is performed by priests. We imagine a deliberate manipulation. We think of skillful strategists who are fully aware of the mechanisms of victimization and who knowingly sacrifice innocent victims in full awareness of the cause with Machiavellian ease. Such things can happen, especially in our time, but they cannot happen even today without the availability of an eminently manipulable mass to be used by the manipulators for their evil purposes, people who will allow themselves to be trapped in the persecutor's representation of persecution, people capable of belief where the scapegoat is concerned. Guillaume de Machaut is obviously no manipulator. He is not intelligent enough. If manipulation exists in his universe, he must be numbered among the manipulated. The details that are so revealing in his text are not revealing for him, evidently, but only for those who understand their real significance. Earlier, I spoke of naive persecutors. I could have spoken of their lack of awareness. Too conscious and calculating an awareness of all that the scapegoat connotes in modern usage eliminates the essential point that the persecutors believe in the guilt of their victim. They are imprisoned in the illusion of persecution that is no simple idea but a full system of representation. Imprisonment in this system allows us to speak of an unconscious persecutor, and the proof of his existence lies in the fact that those in our day who are the most proficient in discovering other people's scapegoats, and God knows we are past masters at this, are never able to recognize their own. Almost no one is aware of his own shortcoming. We must question ourselves if we are to understand the enormity of the mystery. Each person must ask what his relationship is to the scapegoat. I am not aware of my own, and I am persuaded that the same holds true for my readers. We only have legitimate enmities, and yet the entire universe swarms with scapegoats. The illusion of persecution is as rampant as ever, less tragically but more cunningly than under Guillaume de Machat. Happacite lecture, mon semblable, mon frère. If we are at the point where we compete in the penetrating and subtle discovery of scapegoats, both individual and collective, where was the 14th century? No one decoded the representation of persecution as we do today. Scapegoat had not yet taken on the meaning we give it today. The concept that crowds or even entire societies can imprison themselves in their own illusions of victimage was inconceivable. Had we tried to explain it to the men of the Middle Ages, they would not have understood. Guillaume de Machat was much more influenced by the scapegoat effect than we are. His universe was more deeply immersed in its unawareness of persecution than we are, but even so, it was less so than the world of mythology. In Guillaume, as we have seen, just a small portion and not the worst of the Black Death is blamed on scapegoats. In the myth of Oedipus, it is the entire plague. In order to explain epidemics, let me go back. In Guillaume, as we have seen, just a small portion and not the worst of the Black Death is blamed on scapegoats. In the myth of Oedipus, it is the entire plague. In order to explain epidemics, mythological universes have never needed anything more than stereotypical crimes and, of course, those who are guilty of them. Proof can be found in ethnological documents. Ethnologists are shocked by blasphemies, yet for a long time they have had at their disposal the necessary evidence to confirm them. Ethnologists are shocked by my blasphemies, yet for a long time they have had at their disposal the necessary evidence to confirm them. In so-called ethnological societies, the presence of an epidemic immediately rouses the suspicion that there has been an infraction of the basic rules of the community. We are not permitted to call such societies primitive, yet we are expected to describe as primitive everything that perpetuates the mythological type of beliefs and behaviors that belong to persecution in our universe. The representation of persecution is more forceful in myths than in historical accounts, and we are disconcerted by that strength. The representation of persecution is more forceful in myths than in historical accounts, and we are disconcerted by that strength. Compared with such granite-like belief, ours seems paltry. The representations of persecution in our history are always vacillating and residual, which is why they're so quickly demystified, at least within several centuries, instead of lasting for millennia like the myth of Oedipus, which toys with our efforts to understand it. Such formidable belief is foreign to us today. At best, we can try to imagine it by tracing it in the texts. We are led, then, to the determination that the sacred forms a part of that blind and massive belief. Let us examine this phenomenon, beginning with the conditions that make it possible. We do not know why this belief is so strong, but we suspect that it corresponds to a more effective scapegoat mechanism than our own, to a system of persecution that functions at a higher level than our own. To judge by the numerical preponderance of mythological universes, this higher system is more the norm for humanity than our own society, which constitutes the exception. Such a strong belief could not be established and perpetuated after the death of the victims and the persecutors' commemoration in their myths. If there were any doubt left in the relationships at the heart of the community, in other words, if there were not total reconciliation. In order for all the persecutors to be inspired by the same faith in the evil power of their victim, the latter must successfully polarize all the suspicions, tensions, and reprisals that poison those relationships. The community must effectively be emptied of its poisons. It must feel liberated and reconciled within itself. This is implied in the conclusion of most myths. We see the actual return to the order that was compromised by the crisis, or even more often the birth of a completely new order in the religious unity of a community brought to life by its experience. The perpetual conjunction in myths of a very guilty victim with a conclusion that is both violent and liberating can only be explained by the extreme force of the scapegoat mechanism. This hypothesis, in fact, solves the fundamental enigma of all mythology. The order that is either absent or compromised by the scapegoat once more establishes itself or is established by the intervention of someone who disturbed it in the first place. It is conceivable that a victim may be responsible for public disasters, which is what happened in myths as in collective persecutions. But in myths, and only in myths, this same victim restores the order, symbolizes, and even incarnates it. Our specialists have not yet gotten over this. The transgressor restores and even establishes the order he has somehow transgressed in anticipation. The greatest of all delinquents is transformed into a pillar of society. In some myths, this paradox is diminished, censored, or camouflaged, no doubt, by the faithful whom it scandalizes, almost as much as our contemporary ethnologists. But it is no less transparent beneath the camouflage. This is eminently characteristic of mythology. Plato was troubled by this precise enigma when he complained of the immorality of the Homeric gods. Interpreters have stumbled over this enigma for centuries. It is identical with the enigma of the primitive sacred, the beneficial return from the harmful omnipotence attributed to the scapegoat. To understand this return and solve the enigma, we have to re-examine our conjunction of themes, our four stereotypes of persecution, somewhat deformed, plus the conclusion that reveals for us the persecutors reconciled. They really must be reconciled. There's no reason to doubt it, since they commemorate their experiences after the death of the victim and always attribute them unhesitatingly to him. On further thought, this is not surprising. How could the persecutors explain their own reconciliation and the end of the crisis? They cannot take credit for it. Terrified as they are by their own victim, they see themselves as completely passive, purely reactive, totally controlled by the scapegoat at the very moment when they rush to his attack. They think that all initiative comes from him. There's only room for a single cause in their field of vision, and its triumph is absolute. It absorbs all other causality. It is the scapegoat. Thus, nothing happens to the persecutors that is not immediately related to him. And if they happen to become reconciled, the scapegoat benefits. There's only one person responsible for everything, one who is absolutely responsible, and he will be responsible for the cure because he is already responsible for the sickness. This is only a paradox for someone with a dualistic vision who is too remote from the experience of a victim to feel the unity and is too determined to differentiate precisely between good and evil. Admittedly, scapegoats cure neither real epidemics nor droughts nor floods. But the main dimension of every crisis is the way in which it affects human relations. A process of bad reciprocity is its own initiator. It gains nourishment from itself and has no need of external causes in order to continue. As long as external causes exist, such as an epidemic or plague, for example, scapegoats will have no efficacy. On the other hand, when these causes no longer exist, the first scapegoat to appear will bring an end to the crisis by eliminating all the interpersonal repercussions and the concentration of all evil doing in the person of one victim. The scapegoat is only effective when human relations have broken down in crisis, but he gives the impression of affecting external causes as well, such as plagues, droughts, and other objective calamities. Beyond a certain threshold of belief, the effect of the scapegoat is to reverse the relationships between persecutors and their victims, thereby producing the sacred, the founding ancestors, and the divinities. The victim, in reality passive, becomes the only effective and omnipotent cause in the face of a group that believes itself to be entirely passive. If groups of people can, as a group, become sick for reasons that are objective or that concern only themselves, if the relationships at the heart of these groups can deteriorate and then be reestablished by means of victims who are unanimously despised, obviously these groups will commemorate these social ills in conformance with the illusory belief that the scapegoat is omnipotent and facilitates the cure. The universal execration of the person who causes the sickness is replaced by universal veneration for the person who cures that same sickness. We can trace in myths a system of representation of persecution similar to our own, but complicated by the effectiveness of the process of persecution. We are not willing to recognize that effectiveness because it scandalizes us on the levels of both morality and intelligence. We're able to recognize the first evil transfiguration of the victim, which seems normal, but we cannot recognize the second beneficent transfiguration. It is inconceivable that it can unite with the first without destroying it, at least initially. People in groups are subject to sudden variations in their relationships, for better or worse. If they attribute a complete cycle of variations to the collective victim who facilitates the return to normal, they will inevitably deduce from this double transference belief in a transcendental power that is both double and will bring them alternatively both loss and health, punishment and recompense. This force is manifest through the acts of violence of which it is the victim, but is also, more importantly, the mysterious instigator. If this victim can extend his benefits beyond death to those who have killed him, he must either be resuscitated or was not truly dead. The causality of the scapegoat is imposed with such force that even death cannot prevent it. In order not to renounce the victim's causality, he is brought back to life and immortalized. Temporarily, and what we call the transcendent and supernatural are invented for that purpose. Chapter 4, Violence and Magic. In order to explain the sacred, I have compared persecutors' representations of persecution which involve the sacred with those which do not. I have examined what was specific to mythological compared with historical persecutions, but I have neglected the relative quality of that specificity. I have discussed historical distortions as if they had no connection with the sacred, but they do. Although increasingly less apparent, the sacred still persists in medieval and modern texts. I have omitted these instances of survival in order not to minimize the distance between mythology and my chosen texts. Reliance on approximate similarities is all the more annoying in a context where a perfect explanation for dissimilarities exists. The scapegoat mechanism, the real origin of the various kinds of distortions found in persecution, both unintelligible and intelligible, mythological or otherwise, according to the order within which persecution is operating. Now that I have identified this difference in order, I can return to the traces of the sacred that persist in intelligible distortions and consider whether they function as they do in myths. Hatred plays a prominent role in medieval persecutions, and it is easy to see nothing but hatred, especially where the Jews are concerned. During this period, however, Jewish medicine enjoyed exceptional prestige, which can be explained by the real superiority of their practitioners, who were more open than others to scientific progress. But in the particular case of the plague, this explanation is scarcely convincing. The best medicine is no more effective than the worst. Both the aristocrats and the common people preferred Jewish doctors because they associated their power to cure with the power to cause sickness. This medical practice, therefore, cannot be viewed as an example of individuals who are distinguished from others by their lack of prejudice. Prestige and prejudice seem to be two faces of the same attitude, indicating the survival of a primitive form of the sacred. Even in our own time, the almost sacred fear inspired by doctors is not altogether independent of their authority. If a person shows ill will to the Jew, he might infect him with the plague. If, on the other hand, he shows good will, the Jew might spare him or even cure him if he is already stricken. He is seen, therefore, as the last resource because of, and not in spite of, the evil he can do or has already done. The same is true in the case of Apollo. If the Thebans beg him, rather than some other god, to cure them of the plague, they do so because they hold him ultimately responsible. Apollo should not therefore be seen as a particularly benevolent, peaceful, or serene god in the sense Nietzsche and the aestheticians give to the word Apollonian. Like so many others, they were misled by the ultimate fading of the Olympian gods. Despite appearances and weakened theories, this tragic Apollo remains the most abominable of all the gods, the formula Plato reproached Homer for using, as if the poet had indulged in a personal fantasy. I'm going to reread that last paragraph. If a person shows ill will to the Jew, he might infect him with the plague. If, on the other hand, he shows good will, the Jew might spare him or even cure him if he is already stricken. He is seen, therefore, as the last resource because of, and not in spite of, the evil he can do or has already done. The same is true in the case of Apollo. If the Thebans beg him, rather than some other god, to cure them of the plague, they do so because they hold him ultimately responsible. Apart from certain intense beliefs, the scapegoat no longer appears to be merely a passive receptacle for evil forces, but is rather the mirage of an omnipotent manipulator shown by mythology to be sanctioned unanimously by society. Once the scapegoat is recognized as the unique cause of the plague, then the plague becomes his to dispose of at will, either as punishment or a reward, according to his displeasure or pleasure. Queen Elizabeth of England's Jewish doctor, Lopez, was executed at the height of his influence for his attempts at poisoning and for his practice of magic. The slightest failure or denunciation can cause a newcomer to fall far lower than the heights he has climbed. Thus, Oedipus, the savior of Thebes and a licensed healer who bears the signs of a victim, is crushed during times of trouble, just at the moment of his greatest glory, a victim of one of the stereotypical accusations we have identified. Joshua Trachtenberg, The Devil and the Jews, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1943, page 98. H. Michelson, The Jew in Early English Literature, Amsterdam, A.J., Paris, 1928, page 88 FF. On the portrayal of the Jew in the Christian world, see the works of Gavin L. Langmer,